Let's chat! Participants during the original broadcast are invited to join in a live discussion using the chat box below.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Kelsey Thompson, and this is the session Building Resilience for the 2020 NOAA Virtual Conference. Just a real quick background about me and who you're going to be listening to here today. So I am a person with albinism. I am from, originally grew up in a pretty small town in Northern Illinois. Now I live in the Chicago area. And I'm one of three kids. My younger brother, Ed, also has albinism. I'm the middle child, so our older brother does not have albinism. And I've been involved in the NOAA community for a very, very long time, since I was quite little. My family has been involved actually since the first conference in Minneapolis. So having been around the NOAA community for a long time, I've gotten to know a lot of people and heard different stories and perspectives. And I also served on the board of directors for a period of time and was involved with the Albinism Insight magazine. So been to a lot of NOAA conferences and events over that time, and I feel a really strong connection to the albinism community. On a professional level, I work as a vocational rehabilitation counselor with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So I work for the nation's second largest VA hospital here outside of Chicago. And in my role, I work with disabled veterans to help them to reintegrate into the workforce. So it's a mental health program. And I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. So in this presentation, I'm drawing a little bit from both my personal and my professional background. What we're going to be talking about today is this idea of resilience, which is a really hot topic in mental health circles right now, something that's getting studied a lot. And I see a lot of relevance to us in the albinism community, which is why I decided to develop a presentation around this. So first, let's talk about what we mean when we use this term resilience. So if you've ever noticed, there's some people who just refuse to be defeated, even after being knocked down repeatedly. We hear these inspirational stories of entrepreneurs, athletes, social activists, people who just have these amazing life stories where they come up against multiple obstacles and it doesn't look, like they have much of a chance, and they get through them. And not only do they overcome those obstacles, but they thrive and end up doing great things. So what makes these people different a lot of times is this quality of resilience. So it's the process by which people adapt to change, crises, or problems. It's that ability to cope and thrive after significant, prolonged difficulties. The capacity for positive adaptation and that ability to thrive when confronted with adversity. So resilience isn't a character trait. It's something that can be learned by anyone, but learning it takes time and effort. So that's the good news, though, right? Is that this is something that anybody can practice and become good at. And in my job working with homeless and disabled veterans, they've taught me a lot about this idea of resilience as well, our ability to overcome and to thrive despite having very challenging circumstances. So again, this is kind of what I just talked about, that ability to adapt, the ability to overcome is what we talk about when what we mean when we talk about resilience. So there's really two components to resilience. Two things have to be present. One is that exposure to a significant adversity. We don't say you're resilient if nothing bad's ever happened to you, right? And the second aspect of it is what we call self-efficacy. It's that judgment of confidence. I tend to think of this as the little engine that could, and her "I think I can" moment, right? She believes that she's capable of doing it. So it's that hope, that optimism, that sense of belief in yourself. So why we care about resilience, why we think this matters, is because a lot of research has shown that resilience is associated with psychological health, mental health, symptom management, improved quality of life, improved overall health. There's a lot of benefits that we're just now starting to understand about people who have these resilient qualities, this resilient mindset. So as I mentioned, that first ingredient in resilience is adversity. So let's talk about adversity and albinism. This is something that maybe we don't talk about a lot because sometimes it can sound like complaining, right? I mean, and a lot of us adults with albinism we've learned to adapt. We've learned to live with albinism as it is. So we tend not to think so much about these things. But the reality of it is that living with albinism can sometimes be a challenge. It can sometimes be a headache and a hassle. So these are those not so good aspects of living with albinism as I've identified them from my own experience. So on this list, I've included inaccessible environments and products, like think about electronic voting machines, touchscreen kiosks at airports, things like that that are becoming more common that are really not accessible to those of us with low vision. Rude comments, questions, reactions from strangers, bullying, the way that the world can sometimes treat us. Negative portrayals and images of albinism in TV and in movies that were often portrayed in not the most positive way in those media. What I call transportation privilege. So not being able to, as a person with low vision, I'm not able to drive in my state. So not being able to spontaneously just run a quick errand after work, trips taking twice as long, the world just being designed around drivers. That's a pretty big challenge, and it's some adversity that those of us with low vision can sometimes face. Sun protection, boy, that's a hassle, right? I mean, it's, having to be mindful about sunscreen and sun protection, and then, getting sunburned, that's literally a pain. And the vision impairment, the vision aspects of having albinism. So eye fatigue when reading class assignments, not recognizing people when I see them out of context. So you'll notice how I listed the actual visual limitations of albinism pretty far down this list. It wasn't the first thing that I mentioned. And that's because for many of us, it's the social, the technical, the attitudinal barriers that are the most frustrating aspects of living with albinism. I'd rather see the world become more accessible and accepting than feel pressure to change who I am. So because these experiences that have become a regular part of my life since day one, albinism has shaped how I look at myself and how I relate to others. So it can be a source of frustration and limitations, but it can also allow me to see things differently than others. And another thing to keep in mind is that we as people with albinism, we don't know any different. This is all that we've ever known, right? So for our parents and our family members, we can recognize that maybe albinism was something to adapt to. But for us, for me, having albinism is as normal as speaking English or writing with my right hand. It's just what I've always known. So it might seem different to you, but it's normal to us. So that being said, though, think about the world really is designed for people with 20/20 vision. You think about how many activities and environments you encounter in a typical week that assume you have the ability to see certain things, like road signs, restaurant menus, smartphones that default to quote unquote normal text size as opposed to large print. What makes your preferred text size normal and mine abnormal? So when we talk about adversity, there are certain things in our society that tend to almost perpetuate this idea of adversity in kind of a weird way. So society and cultures can really play a part in this. So part of it is that romanticizing hardship. We see this a lot in our news stories, that like suffering and chronic adversity is praised in some regard. Forgive me if this term is offensive to anyone, but there's this notion of what they call inspiration porn, which you see a lot, again, in news stories or in memes that get circulated around, where a person with a disability is praised and in a patronizing way for doing something that would be unremarkable for an able-bodied person. So these things, even though they do have nice intentions, they're meant to be encouraging and inspirational. What they actually do for people with disabilities is kind of perpetuate that notion that we're different and that the expectations are different for us than they are for the rest of the world. Unrealistic media distortions, that pressure to bounce back and to stay positive, the non-resilient qualities almost seem to be seen as like weak or victimized. So in a way, we do have some of these tendencies to praise certain aspects of living with adversity and to shun others. So I'll talk a little bit about stigma and self-stigmatization. I know this was a topic at the 2018 conference that got addressed a lot. So I have a quote here from James Baldwin that I think is really cool when he talks about self-stigma. So he says, "You have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not with its idea of you. I included that there because I like that. I think that's really powerful. So stigma, those qualities or conditions that are viewed negatively by others. And I think we can probably all agree that there is stigma associated with albinism. There's stigma associated with all genetic and human difference to some extent. So there's this tendency then that we all have to then kind of internalize that stigma that we're receiving from the rest of the world, which is what they call self-stigmatization. So it's internalizing and anticipating these messages from the rest of the world. And this matters because there's social, medical, and mental health consequences to this. And this is starting to become researched a bit more with stigmatized populations. So isolation, anxiety, heart disease, depression, discrimination, all of these things are associated with self-stigmatization. So this is why we should care. And it can lead to a cyclical effect, right? So the lack of integration and acceptance into society can lead to social isolation. And then social isolation leads to a lack of understanding and awareness, which leads to greater isolation, which leads to discrimination and depression and anxiety and so forth. And it's a downward spiral. So that's why it's important to learn how to break that cycle and work on developing a more resilient mindset to combat that self-stigmatization, which is difficult to say. So this is something that I developed a while back, and I call it the paradox of albinism. So we as people with albinism, we often get mixed messages about our condition from the world around us. And as humans, we naturally internalize these, right? A lot of times you look to the people around you to tell you, how certain things are to be perceived. So we question, is albinism something to be celebrated or mocked, adored or despised? Where do we fit in? Are we blind? Are we sighted? So I call this the paradox of albinism because we kind of get these different messages. We're not quite blind and we're not quite sighted. I know growing up, I felt that I really felt like I didn't fit into either camp. I knew that my vision was poor and that I saw differently than my friends and other members of my family. But when I was within, blind circles, I almost felt like I had to pretend that I saw less than I did because I have a fair amount of usable vision. When I hold a white cane, I kind of feel like an imposter because I tell myself, well, I know I'm not blind. I'm just not perfectly sighted either. This idea, are we able-bodied or disabled? And again, you have that kind of legal definition of disability. I recognize that as far as the Americans with Disabilities Act is concerned, yeah, I'm a person with a disability and I take pride in that. But I also sometimes question that like self-perception, like really, am I disabled? Because I really don't feel disabled, right? I don't really feel limited in a lot of what I do. We recognize that we're noticeable, but we're often misunderstood. A lot of times, people will recognize, we stand out, the people will notice the fact that I'm different. And sometimes they might even recognize the fact that I have albinism, like, hey, there goes an albino. But do they really understand? And oftentimes they don't. Albinism is one of those conditions that's noticeable, but very rarely is it understood by the people we encounter. And then there's this message too, are we uniquely beautiful, but we're also stigmatized for looking different. So comments from strangers remind us on a daily basis how much people would pay to have hair this color, but they also remind us that we're different and that we're unusual. So it's hard to kind of make sense of that when, as a person with albinism, you do get a lot of mixed messages about these things. So factors that challenge resilience, when we try to power through, these are the things that can make that challenging. And I think in these days of COVID-19, a lot of us can relate to these things that challenge our resilience. Just little day-to-day stressors, having a bad day at work, having a bad day at school, those little things can kind of add up just like mosquito bites and become a pretty significant challenge to adversity. Major changes, switching schools, switching jobs, changes in the family, divorce, things like that. Cumulative events like bullying and microaggressions. Again, that analogy of those being like mosquito bites. It happens once in a while, it's not a big deal. But when it happens repeatedly over and over again, this does become a pretty significant challenge to your resilience. And also acute events, traumas, natural disasters. On a personal level, I'll share my story, but that happened in 2018. The previous NOAA conference in Kansas City was in the summer of 2018. And I was planning to go. I was going to take my family, my husband, my kids. I had planned to do several sessions there at the conference. I've almost never missed a NOAA conference. So I was really looking forward to it. And 4 days before the conference was supposed to start. My father-in-law passed away very unexpectedly, and our plans had to change in a lot of ways. And not only just dealing with the grief of losing a loved one, but having to deal with that change and adapt to that on the fly, not just with myself, but for my kids and my family. Really, really challenging. So it put my resilience to the test. So I also, saying that, I recognize that a lot of what I say here today in this presentation is very easy advice to give, but it's hard to take. It's hard in practice when you're actually living it, to use some of these tools. So I mentioned there some of the things that challenge resilience, one being bullying. And I think this is something that we as people with albinism, especially as kids, can relate to. And I don't want to go into fantastic detail here just because this isn't my area of expertise. I have a little bit of information that I've gathered from the research that I thought was kind of interesting, but we could do an entire session on this alone. So there was an interesting study that was done in children in London. They studied 11,000 children in London to look at the acute effects of bullying. And they found that the effects actually lessened over time, which was really interesting. So bullying had a tendency to cause anxiety, depression, hyperactivity, impulsivity, inattention, conduct problems in children. They did find some pretty strong direct correlations there. But after 2 years, after the bullying had stopped, anxiety tended to lessen. And after 5 years, almost all effects had virtually stopped, though there were still some children that remained vulnerable to, like paranoia and cognitive distortions and things like that. So it shows that, there is hope for survivors. Bullying doesn't last forever, and we can overcome and we can power through. And that some initiatives aimed at stopping bullying, which I know there are a lot of those in the schools these days, which is awesome, and that they should also be paired with programs designed to support resilience. It is really important for our kids to grow up healthy and happy. So in your kids and in yourself, these steps are the same. We're going to talk about how to promote resilience and how to grow that in yourself. And what is kind of cool about all this information is we can use it for our own self-growth, but also if there's parents in the audience here, these are some tips that you can also use to help to teach these qualities to your kids. So researchers in the behavioral health field have studied a lot of people who tend to have this resilient mindset. They want to know what makes these people special. How do you do it? What are you doing differently than other people? And they found a couple interesting common trends. And I realized the text on this slide might be kind of small. And as a low vision person, I apologize for that. So a couple of common things that they did find about the resilient mindset. So one is that people who are resilient tend to surround themselves with a loving support system. We can choose what people we let into our lives, right? So they seek out positive relationships and avoid those people or relationships that tend to be toxic. They accept help from loved ones during times of stress. That's sometimes hard to do. It's hard to admit that you need help, but it can make a big deal in helping you to get through it. There was an interesting article that I found that talked about the experiences of blind and visually impaired adults following several really devastating earthquakes in New Zealand in 2011 and 2012. And it just talked a lot about how during this time of crisis and trauma, people really sought out those connections with others, that need to not be alone. And I think we can kind of relate to that. I remember myself after 9/11 happened and I was in college, I remember just feeling like I need to be with people. I need to talk to somebody. I need that social support right now. So high family connectedness and a sense of belonging to a group or a community has really been found to decrease aggressive responses to bullying and can help people to cope. So choosing those people that you allow into your support system and using them when you need them, when times are tough. Another thing that they found is that ability to make and follow through with plans. People who are resilient have a tendency to look at the big picture and not sweat the small stuff. If things go wrong, they try to keep that big vision in mind. They keep themselves accountable when they set goals, and then they also seek out other people who will. If my goal for the summer is to learn how to play Yankee Doodle on my ukulele, I'm going to set that goal. And maybe I'm also going to tell my husband, like, hey, my goal is that by the time the kids go back to school this fall, I'm going to be able to play Yankee Doodle on the ukulele. And he says, good for you. And then maybe he checks in with me every week, like, how's that going? You've been working on your ukulele skills? So it helps not only to keep myself accountable, but to have somebody else there to kind of help to keep me going. Communication and problem solving skills is another area where people who are resilient tend to thrive. So they are able to take small steps toward goals. And if they find that past negative experiences are causing them to avoid certain people or situations, they consider setting realistic goals to help them to kind of take small steps toward that bigger goal. Having a positive view of yourself and your abilities. So this is kind of that idea of competence. So notice how negative experiences actually make you a stronger and a better person. This idea that I've learned from some of my patients, which I think is kind of cool, which is to be thankful for your problems, like finding something in that you can, not necessarily to sugarcoat it, like, oh, I'm glad I have a flat tire today, but just to find things that from that experience that are going to help you to grow and be a better person. And also this idea of self-care, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit, but taking care of yourself, making sure that you're meeting your own needs as far as sleeping and eating. People who are resilient tend to search for meaning and purpose in the things that we do. They feel useful. They feel like they have a purpose. And as somebody who works in the field of vocational rehabilitation, I can tell you this is something that we all as people need. We all crave that purpose and identity that comes with that. People who are resilient have the capability to manage their feelings and impulses. I'm going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about mindfulness, but they have this ability to accept that change is inevitable. They view life as trial and error, and they're fair when they consider those things that they can and can't change. The serenity prayer that I hear a lot from the patients I work with, the notion that you have to make peace with the things that you can't change and have the strength to change the things that you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Practicing mindfulness, which I mentioned. So sorry about that. So practicing mindfulness, which is a practice that has been embraced by the mental health profession. It's been around for a long, long time as a meditation practice, and now mental health professionals and medical professionals are starting to see the benefits of it as well. And it's an intervention that can be used for anxiety, depression, emotional regulation, pain management, addiction, even managing chronic health issues like heart disease and diabetes. So the goal of mindfulness practice is to increase awareness, to minimize emotional highs and lows, and to increase your ability to experience life without judgment, to be present with your emotions and your thoughts and behaviors without judgment, to recognize them as they are, and to be present with those. So mindfulness sort of increases your awareness of your inside and the outside world, which is, there's a lot of benefits to that. People who are resilient take an active role in improving their circumstances. Sometimes that feeling of helplessness can be really can be really suffocating when you feel like there's absolutely nothing you can do, nothing within your control to make things better. People who are resilient find a way to take an active role in improving their circumstances, even if it's through something small. They have that sense of purpose and vision, self-determination, and also they reflect on things. The self-reflection, they're able to ask questions and to take an honest look at themselves and their circumstances. And they find meaning in what they do. So there's a really cool little parable that I read one time that I really, really like. And it's about 3 bricklayers who are working on the side of the road, and they're putting bricks together. And a man walks past and he asks the first bricklayer, "What are you doing?" And the first bricklayer says, I'm laying bricks and stacking bricks and, laying them. It's like, okay. And he goes to the second bricklayer and he says, "What are you doing?" And the second guy says, "I'm building a wall." And then he goes to the third bricklayer and he says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm building a cathedral." Right? So that third guy was able to kind of keep that big picture in mind. Like, yeah, they were all just literally laying bricks. But that third guy was able to think of what he's doing in the context of something bigger, which helps to give you a better appreciation for the vision and the big goal that you're working toward. So a couple of personal habits that tend to promote resilient thinking. Journaling, just, getting into a habit of writing down your thoughts or, purging experiences on paper. I'm a big fan of journaling. I do it all the time, and it helps sometimes just to write things down. meditation, and other activities that broaden sensory experience like yoga, breathing, audio-visual activities, progressive muscle relaxation, body scans. Those are all really beneficial to do if you can get into practice. Expressing gratitude. This is something that I try to do it with myself, but I have a lot of fun doing this with my kids. Even during the height of the pandemic, when we were all, sheltering in place at home and things were pretty bleak, every day at dinner, I would ask my kids, like, what's something that you're thankful for today? Just give me one thing. It can be something small, but just let's all talk about one thing that we're thankful for. And it cracks me up sometimes, the things that they were able to come up with, but it helps just to find something, even in a bad day, just one little thing that you're thankful for, to express gratitude. Getting involved with leisure activities. I'm going to talk more about those in a second, but it essentially comes down to this idea of self-care. So we talk about this a lot in the mental health world for ourselves. As a mental health practitioner, sometimes the things we have to deal with in our jobs can be really stressful and traumatizing, quite honestly. So the idea of taking care of yourself is really important. You can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself. It's that analogy of like, when you're on an airplane and the oxygen masks drop down, you have to put your own on first before you take care of somebody who's with you. And that's hard to do. Like, I get it as a parent, that is difficult to do sometimes. But when we talk about self-care, it's things like exercise, getting sleep, getting a good night's sleep a priority, your diet, taking breaks, setting boundaries, being able to say no, can be really important so that you don't overload yourself. Engaging in some kind of activity, whether it's reading or art or exercise or walking, even just taking trips, like, either as a solo or with a family, like just being able to step away and treat yourself to something like that is really important as a way of just taking care of yourself to avoid getting burnt out. Combating self-stigmatization, expanding on some of these things I talked about earlier, some of these tips, these things that we can do to try to combat that vicious cycle of self-stigmatization that I talked about. Identifying with a community, finding that you are not alone experience, which I think a lot of us can relate to in NOAH. Just going to a NOAH event, being around other people with albinism has this amazing feeling of like coming home and being with people who really get it, people who look like me, people who understand me. Finding that community, that sense of community that I belong to, means a lot. And seeking out role models too, within the albinism community or outside of it, but just finding folks that we can look up to who have some of these positive qualities. Using constructive humor, making connections and finding humanity in others in any way, whether that's through your job or through volunteer work, through community activities. Finding ways to make connections with others really matters a lot. Taking pride in your accomplishments and focusing on your competence, things that, goals that you set for yourself that you accomplished. Those really help us to then build our confidence going forward and to dig out of that rut. And being persistent. Avoid making comparisons. And this is something that comes up a lot in sessions with my patients. We say, don't compare your inside to somebody else's outside, which is a little cheesy, but essentially, you, especially with social media being what it is, it's so easy to look at a friend and just be like, oh, their life is just so perfect. They make everything look so easy, and their family's wonderful and they're doing great and they're feeling happy. Why can't I be more like that person? Avoid making comparisons like that, because what you see on the surface isn't always a reflection of how things actually are. Nurturing multiple identities and inconsistencies. Each one brings us closer to the real you. Sometimes we have these ideas in our heads that, like, I have this idea of myself, who I think I am and what I should be. And then when something happens and that contradicts that, it can cause a lot of internal conflict. But you have to recognize there really isn't just this one self that you have. You have your contradictions, and that's okay. And, sometimes that's part of becoming who you actually are, is embracing those little inconsistencies that we all have. Three big players basically in what we're talking about here. One is this idea of competence. So competence is mastering a personal or professional skill, proficiency, expertise. Having that sense of competence improves your self-confidence, and it builds social connections. It allows you to reflect on your accomplishments. So when you have demonstrable evidence of success, this counteracts negative messages that you get from society. You can tell yourself, yes, I've overcome things before and I can do it again. That's part of that sense of self-efficacy and confidence. The second one is compassion for others. So it builds a positive view of yourself in relation to other people. We find that shared humanity, making connections, reducing social distance, listening, practicing empathy, sharing common fears and concerns enhances a sense of belonging and shared humanity that we all kind of strive for now more than ever. And then the last one is self-compassion. So non-judgmental acceptance of yourself. Albert Ellis, the psychologist, would call this unconditional self-acceptance, which I remember when I first read that term several years ago, I kind of did a double take and I had to read it a couple times and really think about what that means. Because at the time when I heard that, I thought, unconditional self-accept, like just being accepting of yourself regardless of what you're hearing from others or what messages you're getting from the outside world, like that's really hard. That's hard to get there, but it's something to strive for. So just finding ways to sort of resolve conflicting internal and external visions of the self and just recognizing like, this is who I am and I accept that and I'm okay with that. All right, so the picture I have on this next slide is a silly one. So it shows 3 penguins walking along a beach, and in the middle of the penguins is, I think he's a goose or a swan. I think that's a goose. And the goose is wearing a tuxedo and just kind of walking along with the penguins. And it says, fake it until you become it. So there is a social psychologist named Dr. Amy Cuddy. And she has an amazing TED Talk out there. If you have an opportunity to check it out, I highly recommend it. It's a tearjerker and it's fascinating. So through her groundbreaking research, she's looking at ways in which nonverbal communication and posture impact how we perceive ourselves and how we're perceived by others. So she's noted that our bodies literally change our minds. You think about that. We carry ourselves in such a way, when we carry ourselves in such a way as to convey confidence, eventually that feeling is internalized and we're not just acting confident, we are confident. It's amazing. So she did these studies, and I might be screwing this up a little bit. It's been a while since I watched her video, but she essentially did studies to kind of simulate a job interview, which can be a really stressful scenario to find yourself in, right? So she had one group of candidates and they were told in the waiting room to sit in a really kind of unconfident way. They, were supposed to slouch their shoulders, keep their heads down, make poor eye contact. She wanted them to spend like 2 minutes before their job interview just sitting in a way that was not confident. And then she had a second group and she said, okay, for 2 minutes before you go into your job interview, I want you to take a power pose. So maybe standing like with your hands on your hips, chest out, chin up, looking, straight ahead, looking powerful and confident. And just hold that pose for 2 minutes. That's all. And then each group went into their interviews, and the interviewers, by the way, didn't know. It was a blind study, so the interviewers didn't know which person was in which group. And they found that the people who were in the power pose group, the people who had to spend 2 minutes holding that confident pose, were perceived better by the interviewers in just like every possible way. And they felt better about themselves too. They felt more confident in the interview. They felt that they made a good impression. And then when they actually looked at their brains, they found that the people who held the power pose for 2 minutes actually had higher levels of cortisol in their brains, which is associated with the feelings of confidence and empowerment. So being just holding that pose, even if you're not feeling confident, just looking confident really reflects back and can change your mindset, which is really wild when you think about it. So I wanted to talk also about the value of leisure activities. I mentioned those as one of the tools you can use to kind of help to build resilience in yourself or in your kid. So Glenda Jessup wrote her master's thesis on this topic. So she did a qualitative study of young adults who were visually impaired, and she found some really interesting connections between leisure activities and resilience. So check this out. Leisure activities for kids who are visually impaired were found to reduce social isolation, promote social connections with peers with shared interests. So even informal or family activities like having a family game night or something like that had the potential to develop into more mature activities that fostered these connections. Leisure activities also promoted feelings of acceptance. They provided stress relief, so they improved physical and mental health, helped kids to overcome anxiety and fear. They provided support and adversity, so the kids found that perspective on fear, adversity, and stress. They promoted optimism about the future, established a positive self-identity, gave kids access to fitness and health learning, gave them new experiences, challenges, enjoyment, an opportunity to contribute to others, opportunities to learn more about themselves, developing self-management skills like setting goals and time management. They found that leisure activities gave visually impaired kids a chance to develop skills and a sense of accomplishment. So that, again, that sense of mastery, when you feel like you have the confidence to take on new challenges because you've done it once, you can do it again. That sense of self-efficacy, I think I can. They promoted a sense of competence, optimism, and that ability to thrive amidst adversity. They challenged social stereotypes and prejudices about disability, those lowered expectations that we sometimes come up against. Like, holy schlaboli, that list is amazing, right? Like, who wouldn't want to have all of those things for yourself or for your kids? So just finding some good, meaningful leisure activities, recreational activities, sports, hobbies, whatever, can really have a lot of benefit down the road. So those of us who struggle with managing stress or coping with adversity tend to want to shield our kids from these things because of our own experiences. So I wanted to include a little bit at the end of my presentation here, just for the parents in the house, to talk about how to nurture a resilient child. So this author, Margarita Tartakovsky, who has a great name, she wrote a blog for Psych Central where she identified 10 tips to raising resilient kids. And this, I think, is really good advice for all parents, but especially parents of kids with albinism. So first thing she said is don't accommodate every need. Give your kids a chance to learn how to accommodate themselves. And occasionally that means you have to watch them struggle, which I get. I'm a parent myself. It's not always easy to watch your kids struggle, but that's also how we learn to problem solve. Avoid eliminating all risk. Instead, offer age-appropriate freedom. So again, sometimes kids have to fail. Sometimes they have to get hurt in order to learn and to grow. Teaching them to problem solve. Teach your kids concrete skills like role-playing social skills or nonverbal communication. Teaching your kids how to talk about albinism to a friend, to a teacher, to a doctor. Learning how to develop their own story to tailor it to different audiences. Avoid why questions. Instead, ask, how are you going to fix that? Again, don't swoop in there and just fix everything for them. Help your child to brainstorm ways that they can fix their own problems. Don't provide all the answers. When a kid worries about something like, what if all the kids in my new school make fun of me? Help them to brainstorm how to handle this worst case scenario and empower them. And this is something that I do with my daughter a lot when she says, oh, what if all the kids in my class laugh at me? I'll tell her, okay, what if all the kids in your class laugh at you? Like, let's just roll with that worst case scenario, as unlikely as that is to happen. What if that happened? What would you do? And I just kind of encourage her to talk that through and think about how she would handle it. And that way, when she's in the real situation, chances are it's not going to be the nightmare situation that she envisioned it to be, but she feels a little bit more confident to handle it. Avoid talking in catastrophic terms. Let your kids make mistakes. This is something we hear a lot for parents of kids with albinism, but it is really important. Let your kids make mistakes and learn from them. You can't shelter them from those things all the time. Help your kids to manage their emotions, validate feelings, allow them to be present with their feelings, and then help them to figure out what to do next. So there's no such thing as, oh, I should feel this way or I should feel that way. You feel what you feel, and your feelings are valid. And it's important as parents that you help your kids to, one, be able to identify those feelings and put a name to them, and to convey empathy and validation that how they're feeling is okay. And then lastly, to model resiliency. So again, as parents, our kids look to us as an example of how to do things. So being calm and consistent, and you know what, sometimes we're going to have situations where we don't handle things as well as we could have. We're going to make mistakes, but when you do, be upfront with your kids about that, and maybe debrief if you feel like you didn't handle a situation well. Like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what we all could have done differently there and how we can learn from that. There's a really great book called Whole Brain Child. If anyone's interested, shoot me an email. I can get you the author's name. I don't have it in front of me, but the book just has some other really good tips about helping kids to work with different emotions. And it gives you a really good understanding too about how kids' brains develop and how different parts of the brain are involved in different areas where sometimes kids maybe struggle a bit. So this concludes my presentation here.
Calling all PWAs who love to read. NOAA is hosting a PWA book club with virtual meetings on Zoom every 1 to 2 months depending on the book length. All PWAs 18 and older can join NOAA's book club. Simply sign up and get your hands on a copy of the current book. Members will take turns picking the next reading selection and facilitating the discussion. To join or for more information, visit www.albinism.org/book club.